Here at the Wilson Center. Welcome all of you to the Wilson Center. As many of you know, the Center is a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, established by Congress in 1968 to commemorate and further his ideals and concerns. Here at the Center, we foster research, discussion, and collaboration on important national and international issues, and hope thereby to provide links between the world of ideas and the world of policy. As an in-house example of collaboration, today's event is co-sponsored by 4 of the programs here at the Wilson Center: the Kissinger Institute, the Asia Program, the China Environmental Forum, and the Environmental Change and Security Program. Our topic for today is China and climate security. Examination of the security dimensions of climate change, particularly in China, has recently begun to receive greater attention both in China and internationally. We're privileged today to have 2 scholars who have looked at this issue and will address the emerging domestic and foreign and security policies we can expect from a China grappling with these changes, along with their implication for the region and global security mechanisms. Our speaker is Linda Jacobson. She assumed the position of the Beijing-based senior researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, on the 1st of March this year. Before that, she worked for 10 years for the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, most recently as director of its China program and senior researcher. She's lived and worked in China for 15 years and published 6 books on Chinese and East Asian society. Commenting on Linda's talk will be Murray Scott Tanner, a China analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis in Alexandria. He's written and published widely on Chinese and East Asian politics and security issues, including social unrest in China, the rule of law, China-Taiwan relations, China's relations with its neighbors, including Russia and North Korea. He's also published numerous books and articles on these and other topics. Full biographical information is available outside on a sheet there. So, with that brief introduction, welcome again, and I invite Linda to make her remarks.
Thank you, Doug. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'd like to first thank the Kissinger Institute and Doug Spellman for this invitation to speak today. I also want to, of course, thank the co-organizers, the Asia Program, the China Environmental Forum under Jennifer Turner, the Environmental Change and Security Program under Jeffrey DeBelco, and of course I'm very grateful to Scott Tanner for agreeing to be the discussant today. In this talk, I'm going to first focus on China's approach to climate change from a climate security perspective, then move on to very briefly touch upon China's predicament in the realm of foreign policy when it comes to tackling climate change and also climate security. And lastly, I'll put forward some thoughts, they are indeed just thoughts, regarding the answers to the questions that were posed in today's event's invitation. What shifts in China's domestic, foreign, and security policy can be expected from China's growing awareness of climate security, and what could possibly be the implications for regional security mechanisms? So first, China's approach to climate change as a security challenge. After the United States National Intelligence Council, NIC, in June, about 1 year ago, published parts of a 58-page confidential report on the security threats posed by climate change, Chinese security analysts started pushing for this issue to also be taken more seriously within China. Before that, climate change was hardly ever mentioned in the public in China. I did a search of Chinese sources, and I found that one of the very few times that climate security as a term was even mentioned before 2008 was in 2006, when a vice premier did list it, climate security, as one of the many non-traditional security threats which is challenging China's national security. Instead, climate security has been approached by Chinese officials on the basis of environmental and economic interests that it poses to the well-being of the Chinese people and, of course, more largely to mankind at large. For example, in the quite extensive white paper that the Chinese government published on climate change just a year ago, the word climate security is not even mentioned. Food security has been, still is, the main focus of any analysis describing the threats that China is facing, will face from climate change. But after the US NIC report came out, this term climate security has cropped up in several statements by public officials, also top leaders, and the NIC report has been referred to as, quote, a useful reference for China in its own climate change studies. While the NIC report itself is confidential, some analysis which was used as raw material has been published. Countries were ranked in terms of 3 climate risks: sea level rise, increased water scarcity, and an aggregate measure of vulnerability based on a projected temperature change. On all 3 of these fronts, China faces immense challenges. The greatest number of people who are exposed to sea level rise in the world are in China, in the Philippines, in Egypt, and also in Indonesia. The Philippines and China alone have about 64 million people. It has been estimated in the lowest elevation zones. That's 1 meter above sea level. According to the NIC report, climate change will compound already difficult conditions in many developing countries, and these trends will likely increase the likelihood, one should say, of humanitarian crisis, the potential for epidemic diseases, and regionally destabilizing population migrations. Now, according to the research interviews I've recently been doing in Beijing, Chinese policymakers have paid particular attention to 2 sentences in the public parts of the NIC report. The first one is, climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability. And the second one is that climate change alone will not trigger state failure in any state before the year 2030, but the impacts will worsen existing problems such as poverty, social tensions, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, and weak political institutions. In several off-the-record discussions, and actually also in a few commentary published in China, many Chinese observers have noted that this report was endorsed by all 16 US intelligence agencies. This emphasis on climate change as a threat multiplier, which exasperates existing trends, tensions, instability, was already very clear, very evident in the European Commission's paper, Climate Change and International Security, which was published 3 months before the NIC report. But, as is often the case in China, it was the American intelligence community's report which captured the attention of Chinese officials a lot more than the EU report did. Instability, of course, is a word that, generally speaking, catches the attention of the top leaders in China. Several Chinese researchers who I've spoken to say in internal meetings these 2 sentences from the NIC report are often cited, and it's pointed out that China is particularly vulnerable, not only in the geographical sense, because of existing water shortages, climate fluctuations across this huge landmass, but also because political institutions are weak and have already been acknowledged by some experts in China to be a factor explaining the weak crisis management capabilities of the Chinese authorities. These researchers that I've spoken to have, among others, highlighted the havoc that was caused a year and a half ago during the Chinese New Year holiday when a historically bitter winter storm hit southern China, when the collapse of the infrastructure combined with the complete inability of the officials to coordinate rescue efforts left millions, literally millions, if not tens of millions, of travelers stranded in very harsh conditions, leading to several deaths. These researchers have warned that this really was the beginning only of the encounters that China will have with climate threats. I think in this conjunction it's important to note that the powerful, the effective information apparatus in China was very successful in the aftermath of this bitter winter storm, as it was called. Everyone's attention was focused on this quote-unquote historically harsh storm, and that it was an unnaturally severe natural disaster, not at all on the authorities' capabilities or the lack of in responding to the crisis. And this, one can say, will not necessarily be the case in the future. As a sign of the new seriousness that China now views climate security, the National Defense University in China was commissioned late last year by the State Council to write a detailed internal report about climate change from the perspective of security threats it poses. This report is due to be completed at the end of this year. In addition, at that same time, late last year, the General Staff Headquarters of the PLA set up what has been called the Military Climatic Change Expert Committee, that has representation from academics and experts from both inside and outside of the military. This committee has been asked to research the impact of climate change on military struggle, as well as military capacity building, so as to, quote, provide political and technical support to the PLA in responses to the problems of climate change. Several military analysts I have spoken to say that they see the elevation of climate change to climate security as a means to boost the image of the PLA, because one can foresee that natural disasters and helping to deal with them will become a major task. One saw that already after the Sichuan earthquake last year. Several military analysts I have spoken to said it was the first time since Tiananmen in 1989 that the PLA felt they were looked upon really as the people's army. Now to the second part of my remarks. I'll just briefly touch upon this delicate balancing act in the realm of foreign policy that China and China's leadership in particular is pursuing with regard to tackling the challenges of climate change. This is a balancing act of not wanting to give up the foremost goal of economic growth, while at the same time wanting very badly to nurture an image of a responsible government. I think everyone in a room with an audience of this type knows China is very adamant that combating climate change must not deter economic development. On the other hand, the government is as eager and as adamant that they should portray themselves as a government willing to shoulder international responsibility, very much in line with China's rising status as a great power. I think it's important to note that this is necessary not only to meet the demands of the international community, but also to satisfy various segments of Chinese society who are very sensitive to China's reputation abroad, and they very much wish to see China either respected as an equal or admired as a great power. The Chinese government, as we know, certainly acknowledges the severity of climate change, and perhaps contrary to some misperceptions in the West, China has really adopted de facto a very serious climate change agenda. This is based largely on an understanding that the impact of climate change on China's domestic economy could be very severe. China has implemented a large number of specific policies. I'm not going to go through them. I will, though, mention that, of course, 2 weeks ago we heard from Hu Jintao, the president of China, in his UN speech, that China, in addition to a rather robust climate agenda, is now pledging to reduce the rate of carbon intensity in China. What does this mean? It means that though total emissions will continue to rise, the fossil fuel burnt for each rise in economic growth will fall by, quote unquote, a notable margin by the year 2020 compared to 2005. But then, despite what I call this very robust climate change policy that China has, and despite this desire to portray itself as a responsible government, China is not going to change its position that uncontrolled greenhouse gas emissions by developed countries has caused climate change, and therefore it is the foremost responsibility of industrialized nations to do something about it and cut emissions. Nor will Chinese authorities cease to remind outsiders that China has the same right to develop as industrialized nations did. And finally, China, like all other developing nations, will not give up its demand that industrialized nations must foot the bill for the technology that developing countries need to facilitate the move toward a low-carbon economy. Last month, the European Union announced, as the first industrialized bloc of nations, a 58 billion euro annual sum to facilitate this move for developing countries. But just to put that in perspective, several Chinese scientists have in public said that China alone needs about 6 times that amount annually for the next 20 years to meet the technological challenges of moving toward a low-carbon economy. So despite what one reads in the newspapers about agreements on clean tech between China and the Europeans, between China and the United States, I think we're going to hear about a very major clean energy initiative between the United States and China next month when Obama visits China. Despite all of these very promising sounding steps, there will, for decades to come, in my view, remain a very severe tension between China and the industrialized nations regarding what are China's obligations toward the international community. In fact, one quite senior Chinese analyst last week said to me in Beijing that he sees climate change as one of the most contentious issues between China and the EU for the next 5 to 10 years. And then to the questions posed in the invitation. What shifts in domestic, foreign and security policies can be expected from China as this acknowledgement of the importance of climate security deepens in Beijing? I see 2 emerging and possibly contradictory trends. First, to the domestic front. On the one hand, China's top leadership knows that massive, really massive restructuring is needed in the energy sector for China to adopt a low-carbon economy. And this, of course, in turn would keep Chinese companies competitive and ensure long-term economic growth. So therefore, emphasizing the importance of climate security and highlighting the threat multiplier factor, I think will be used as a driving force to spur on much needed reform. China needs to save much more energy. China needs to be much more energy efficient. And China needs to rely on clean coal in vastly larger quantities than today's official targets envision. One statistic that I'd like to mention, because it sheds light on China's predicament, but it also sheds light on Hu Jintao's pledge in his UN speech, is that although CO2 emissions per unit GDP have declined for almost a decade now in China, they still remain 5 times higher than the United States and 10 times higher than in Japan. Moving toward a genuinely low-carbon economy is going to be a mammoth challenge for China. So just as the WTO membership, both before and after 2001, was used by the Chinese top leadership, especially Zhu Rongji, to push the reluctant Chinese bureaucracy to accept and implement necessary economic structural reforms, I think that in the same way the risks related to climate security will be used to convince local and especially mid-level officials who often have vested interests in energy-intensive industries to accept very painful but necessary reforms, all, of course, in the name of national security. And so this trend should certainly be seen excuse me, this trend should certainly be seen as a very positive one for China. On the negative side, I foresee a hardening of China's position in all discussions related to possible carbon tax, possibly an obligatory cap-and-trade regime. Chinese officials are already very vehement in their public opposition to any trade tariffs in the name of reducing carbon emissions. And I certainly see this stance becoming even more entrenched as Chinese leaders realize how the race to achieve a low-carbon economy might prove to be one of life and death for Chinese competitiveness. In several articles by Chinese analysts today, we outsiders are constantly reminded that China will lose its competitive edge in low-cost export commodities if more expensive clean energy is forced upon manufacturers with the intent of reducing these greenhouse gas emissions. And at the moment in international climate change negotiations, China stresses that a sizable proportion of its own emissions, up to a third, actually originate from commodities that are produced in China but then exported to the rest of the world. Of course, this is quite an interesting approach. China has, after all, itself chosen this path of its reliance, its very strong reliance on exports to develop its economy. Yet, by making this assertion about its exports, China seems to be trying to absolve itself of any responsibility for carbon emissions related to exports. Also, on the negative side, an increasingly mainstream view among Chinese bureaucrats and also among other segments in society is that climate change is yet another maneuver by the industrialized nations, especially the United States, especially the European countries, to impede China's rise. As China rises, and if China feels that it is increasingly vulnerable in the realm of climate security, this view could indeed become more strong. I'm more than happy to elaborate on this question of mistrust and suspicion during the discussion time. Within China today, there are several groupings who are carrying on quite an intense debate about what, in the end, are China's national interests when it comes to climate change and climate security. This debate is mainly occurring between officials of the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, who are in charge of climate issues domestically, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is in charge of climate change negotiations internationally. And then to the possible shifts in foreign and security policy due to this emphasis on climate security in China. I think on the positive track, I foresee an increased willingness on China's part to engage in multilateral efforts to improve disaster relief capabilities and a readiness also to combat the spread of diseases. I foresee China wanting to learn more from outsiders and perhaps becoming more transparent with regards to crisis management capacity building. Because of climate security and an awareness of the importance of climate security, it could well be that the militaries that China deals with actively, especially the militaries like with Russia, they could find much more common ground, perhaps even with the United States. In fact, the director of the Environmental Change and Security Program, Jeffrey DeBelco, has, together with Kent Butts, written an op-ed piece in the Christian Science Monitor suggesting just that actually climate security could become a so-called quote-unquote easier issue for the US and China, Chinese militaries to discuss among themselves. On the negative side, again, I think there's a possibility that China will choose to stress its current stance of being a victim of climate change, rather than one to be held responsible for it. One consequence could be that China will take an even more active leading role within the G77 grouping, or perhaps among the BRIC nations, to form a more aggressive, a more cohesive front against the industrialized nations on a wide range of issues, ranging from food security to trade and so on. There are an increasing number of Chinese foreign policy analysts, and also to some extent officials who are involved with the foreign policy decision-making process, who advocate that China should stand up much more staunchly in several kinds of international settings. At present, there is no international body to deal with climate security. Whether China decides to take the lead in establishing one is still an open question. So, on the one hand, I have a vision of China increasingly willing to engage more actively in regional security mechanisms, especially ones that are related to crisis management capacity building. But then also, I have a vision of China wanting to flex its muscle, both politically and militarily. For example, if energy resources become scarce, China might insist on alone exploring potential energy deposits in the South China Sea. I'd like to, in conclusion, touch upon this whole notion of climate security as a term, or the securitization of climate, as some scholars have put forward. I know that among Western climate change and environmental academics, this term, climate security, is a somewhat controversial one. There are those who question, is it positive that the military would become involved in environmental issues? When I first spoke about today's topic, China and climate security, it was at a round table in Stockholm a month ago, at a round table organized by CIPRI and the Stockholm Environmental Institute. And present was the Chinese ambassador in Stockholm, Ambassador Chen Mingming, and he commented at length on my talk, and I'd like to just share a few of his comments with you. The ambassador noted that climate change is viewed in China primarily as a development issue, although it is increasingly seen as having security dimensions. According to Ambassador Chen, of particular interest to the Chinese government were the potential social tensions and instability impacts of climate change, such as water shortages and sandstorms, which threaten the social fabric which is so vital for China's growth. I've here very intentionally not spoken about these possible conflicts because I presume Scott Tanner will be touching upon that. But Ambassador Chen went on to say that although climate change has security dimensions, he's not at all sure if climate change should be framed at all as a security issue. He said that framing climate change as a security issue would cause international suspicion and not in any way assist in addressing the policy challenges. But from my experiences in Beijing, from talking to Chinese climate change experts, I'd say my view differs from Ambassador Chen's. In China, those who today are working very constructively toward nudging China in the direction of a low-carbon economy, whether they're academics, policymakers, or grassroots-level activists, they have been so far very happy to see Chinese high-level officials kind of embrace this term climate security as a national goal. I think that involving and enlisting the support of the military and defense industries is seen very much as a sign that more money will be invested in new technologies. And from the viewpoint of the Chinese who are actively advocating China and China's pursuit of environmentally sustainable policies, they see this as a very positive trend. I end there, and I very much look forward to Scott's comments and also to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to echo what Linda has said in thanking Doug Spellman, Jeff DeBalco, Jennifer Turner, their programs here at the Wilson Center for inviting us here today. I do want to start out by clarifying one thing before I sort of act as a commentator on this paper here. In the introductions, Doug Spellman said that we had here, quote, some scholars who have looked at this issue. Let me be very clear about this. Linda is the scholar on this issue. I'm the guy who kind of looked at it. This is not an area of my expertise. I bring to this, though, a background of somebody who spends his day following a wide variety of security issues in China, from the military to internal security and a number of others. And from that perspective, I want to raise a couple of questions here, because it is my understanding that this is an emerging topic, and it is an emerging research agenda for Linda. And so I want to try to hopefully spur some thoughts or some questions about that. The first, we had a fascinating conversation, a group of us beforehand, about this whole debate over the securitization of climate. And it raises a whole series of questions about the very concept of climate security. China is a country that pays a lot of attention to security. And one hears a number of different kinds of securities there, and one ends up wondering, what is the relationship between climate security and the other securities that the Chinese government ends up paying attention to? National security, energy security, maritime security, space security, natural resource security, and so on. There's also the question, when one speaks of any kind of security, implicitly one is usually speaking about some kind of threat to that security. And there's always a political process involved in defining what the nature of that threat is. Who gets to define it? How is the threat to climate security in China defined? What is defined specifically as not being a threat or ignored as a threat to security? And lastly, on that question of concept, Often when we look at some aspect of security, we're worried about the security of the source, where something comes from. Food security is about where is our food going to come from? How do we make sure we keep getting it? Energy security is about minimizing threats to the source of security. Clearly, climate security is to some extent about dealing with and trying to control threats to the climate. But from the standpoint of any government like China, it is almost certainly also going to be about, let's call it the output side, dealing with the national security consequences of climate change. And from that, I want to talk about two other things, two aspects of this. One is the potential implications of climate change for China's domestic security, in particular social unrest, and the other is the impact that this rising issue of climate security is likely to have on the People's Liberation Army, China's army, and how it sees itself and its mission if it's going to be involved in climate security. With regard to domestic security, climate change raises some really challenging and potentially very serious issues. China is confronted with a very serious dilemma here. Any Chinese official will insist to you that one of the major factors for dealing with China's now serious internal security, now serious social unrest problem is to continue rapid economic growth, the generation of jobs, and so on. And yet they will also tell you that one of the major sources of unrest in their society are the sorts of problems that occur as a result of bad, corrupt, failed governance, failures of local government that cause unrest. When we look at least the official statistics that the Chinese government periodically releases on aspects of social unrest, and we look at environmentally related unrest, it is a significant problem. Depending on who's doing the estimating, it seems to be that of the approximately 100,000 protests that go on in China in a given year, maybe 5 to 10% are officially sourced to being related to the environment. But is that the magnitude of the problem that climate change could cause? I don't think it is. I think potentially this could be something much more serious. Because one of the two really serious sources of unrest in Chinese society is anything having to do with arable land or anything having to do with land that people can build on. When you talk about the illegal or arbitrary confiscation of arable land, failure of governments to relocate people, to compensate them adequately for the land that they have lost, you're now suddenly talking about, depending on who's doing the estimating, about 30%, maybe a third of the incidents of unrest that occur in China each year. And as we know, one of the very likely consequences of climate change is going to be an enormous impact on the distribution, the supply, and the quality of arable land, which has been in short supply in China for how many millennia? No. This is not a problem either that's going to be very easy to resolve. We talk about environmental unrest in China, and sometimes we get the idea that it's always a case of some law-breaking, polluting company versus some aggrieved citizen who's suffering from environmental damage, and if they will simply make the law-breaking polluter obey the rules, the aggrieved citizens will stop protesting in the street. Climate change, particularly when you're talking about changing over the production structure for energy, factories, and something like that, particularly in a country with an enormous number of small energy factories, inefficient, polluting ones, this could be quite serious. Closing these factories down affects jobs, it affects communities and things. And China, I think, is finding that in a number of cases, in the effort to deal with a pollution problem, or in this case a climate change problem that causes unrest, they may make concessions to one group of citizens and find that in the process they have offended the interests of another set of citizens. There was a case a couple of years ago, where they closed down a petrochemical factory in a large city in the south. They did this because a lot of people had protested against it. They didn't want it there. Fine. They did what the citizens wanted. They closed the petrochemical factory. And then they found themselves dealing with angry citizens who had been promised jobs in that petrochemical factory. I'm not sure how you say northern spotted owl in Mandarin, but it's perfectly clear that they have a very difficult dilemma that they have to deal with. And climate change, because of the way that it affects land and the problems that it creates for local governments in dealing with those in a fair and transparent way, in a lot of ways, I think is going to exacerbate exactly the kind of issues that Chinese local government handles badly, and handles badly in ways that tend to cause social unrest. So I'm concerned about this. Switching over to a second issue, the impact on China's security system, the People's Liberation Army. Climate change and the issue of climate security is coming aboard at a time when the People's Liberation Army is not only rapidly modernizing, but is seriously reconsidering what are its missions, what is it there to do, what are the new missions that are evolving for China's military. This was spurred in 2004 by a series of speeches given by the party General Secretary Hu Jintao on the so-called new historical missions of the People's Liberation Army. And he said, among other things, that the Chinese military is supposed to protect China's expanding national interests, protect world peace, to do the kinds of things that are consistent and appropriate to being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. For the first time in the history of the People's Republic, we have a definition of the missions of the military that is not necessarily linked to the defense of Chinese territory, that is potentially more expansive than that. Now, I'm not, please don't rush home and attribute to me saying that the Chinese army has just rhetorically queued up for taking over the world. I'm not saying that at all. But one of the things that has occurred as a result of this is that the military is increasingly paying a lot of attention to what they refer to as military operations other than war, or for military acronym types, MOOTW or MUTWA, as they seem to like to pronounce it. This includes a growing list of non-traditional security missions, including a number that we can expect China and East Asia generally are going to have to face a lot more of as a result of climate change. And that includes such things as rescue assistance to people and also handling a wide variety of so-called suddenly occurring incidents, a category that includes, among other things, dealing with earthquakes, floods, typhoons, but also the social unrest and the governance problems that come in their wake. So climate change, as I say, is going to affect, climate change is likely to lead to an increase in the types of incidents around China's border, not only around China's border, but also affecting China's security partners in South and Southeast Asia, and is going to increase demands on a number of portions of the People's Liberation Army, and specifically certain parts of it. China's Navy, and probably to a lesser extent, the airlift capacity of the People's Liberation Army Air Force, but also the growing civil affairs and firefighting and rescue missions of China's paramilitary forces, the People's Armed Police. And this is something that recent major documents in the Chinese military have seen very clearly and noted on, that these types of missions are going to be more frequent in the future. This is also, climate change also is going to raise a whole series of new problems for the Chinese military and its security diplomacy in East Asia. For example, how to deal with the national security consequences of China's borders and the rivers that go across it. Virtually every noteworthy river in South and Southeast Asia has, of course, its headwaters in the Himalayas. And I did get that right geographically. It's been, okay, good. The question will be what will happen to China's security relations with its neighbors as a result of this, but also what's going to happen to key principles of that security diplomacy, such as the notion of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Will climate change-related problems cause China to have to reconsider how it involves itself with its neighbors, and also whether or not its neighbors feel they increasingly have a right to make demands on the way China deals with environmental issues on its own territory. It's also going to lead to increasing demands from the international community. One reads increasingly these days about a complaint that Western analysts have moved away from a theory that China is going to collapse and have moved away from a theory that China is a threat to a new theory that China has responsibilities. And this disturbs them in a number of ways, that they know they're going to be getting a number of demands from the international system. And last but not least, climate change could cause enormous organizational dilemmas for the way that China's military and its security system organize themselves to deal with these sorts of problems. I could go on this on a great length, but I'll just give you one tiny little example, and that is the example of the Chinese Coast Guard. There is no Chinese Coast Guard. Or, depending on another way you look at it, there are a dozen Chinese Coast Guards. China's coastal defense and security and law enforcement and resource management and rescue missions are divided up amongst an enormous array of competing and overlapping organizations and jurisdictions. The Navy and the People's Liberation Army, the People's Armed Police, local and provincial civilian police organizations. The Ministry of Agriculture has an aspect of this coastal mission. So does the State Oceanographic Administration. We cannot take it for granted that they coordinate with each other, or that they have attained a rational organization of the equipment and funding that is necessary for dealing with a growing number of problems in China's coastal areas. So there will be a number of additional organizational challenges. I've taken too much time already, but I simply want to stop by saying that Linda has highlighted for us a vast and really important topic and made a very excellent start of getting us to think about it. And we all look forward very much to hearing the additional research on this in the future. Thank you very much.
Linda and Scott, thank you very much. I think I would just echo what Scott has said, that I think both speakers have laid out a very interesting terrain of some similar issues, but put in different ways and new ways. I would invite comments and questions. If I could ask you to identify yourself and look for a microphone. We have ones on both sides. Before you speak. Yes, in the green shirt.
Thank you. Hello, David Cohen-Tanucci from the Natural Resources Defense Council. I have a quick question for Linda Jacobson. You mentioned in passing during your talk the risks of loss of economic competitiveness associated with addressing climate change and carbon emissions in China. I would be very interested in hearing more about this. Essentially, it seems that a large part of the energy inefficiency of China comes from basically what I mentioned, energy inefficiency, and that these measures, as much as 2/3 of the emissions in China, could actually be dealt with from energy efficiency measures. And a number of reports have recently outlined that these kinds of measures actually pay for themselves over time. So it seems from an intuitive standpoint that loss of economic competitiveness might not be as important as one would expect. So I would be very interested in hearing more about the work that has gone into this risk and the possible implications. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one by one.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, a vast number of Chinese industries are hugely energy inefficient. You're quite right. The problem is that at the local level, there are a lot of vested interests in the industries. The whole idea of having to take into consideration greenhouse gas emissions while trying to make money just does not appeal. There's a collusion of a lot of people, not only the factory owner and the factory manager, but local officials starting from the township, the county, and so on. So it's going to be a massive amount of effort that is needed from the central leadership to enforce genuine energy inefficiency. There are still experts who wonder that though China at the moment is on target to meet its energy efficiency targets, are the numbers being reported truthfully? How much real change has taken place? When one is so energy inefficient, it's quite easy to get the numbers a little better, but then the next phase could be very, very painful when one takes into consideration these vested interests.
In the back.
My name is Maria Ivanova. I'm a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I have a question again for Linda Jacobson. You mentioned toward the end of your talk that there is no international institution for climate security. In fact, there is no international institution for climate change, or very much along the lines that Scott Tanner mentioned. There are so many, just like the Chinese Coast Guard, that we really don't have any. So my question really is, what kind of international institutions might China be able to support or even create, given the complex reality within which it currently stands?
I certainly, thank you for the question. I certainly don't have a good answer to your question. And I should mention that this whole idea of the lack of an international institution came up from an official from the Swedish Defense Ministry who was there to listen to our round table at SIPRI in Stockholm some weeks ago. She pointed out that after hearing what I said, that China is, for example, in the realm of the economic world order at the moment, very carefully but clearly taking steps towards advocating a complete reshuffle of the world order if they were allowed to do so. And so I see if China feels threatened, feels aggrieved, it could take the initiative to start or take the lead in establishing an international organization to deal with climate change and climate security. What kind of an organization, I really have no idea. But there's a lot of movement in China at the moment in the international sphere. There's a lot of newfound self-confidence, and it'll pop up, I imagine, in very interesting ways, sometimes very constructively from the point of view of the so-called industrialized world, but sometimes also less positively.
Right here.
Hello. I'm Rory Marston. I'm the Executive Director for Climate and Weather for ITT Space Industries. My question is for any of you. When it comes to accountability for greenhouse gases, there's going to have to be an international organization, or at least data coming out of some type of satellites or some type of system that's going to give data that anybody can get the raw data to, the Chinese, the Japanese. Do you believe the Chinese will be willing to let overflight accept the data? You know, there's already issues between, Japan and India and China as far as who's polluting what country. Can you expand on that, please?
Do we think the Chinese will permit what? What specifically?
Specifically, do you think they'll play ball and say, okay, yes, you can look at pollution over our area and we'll accept it as being accountable? Do you think we'll have treaties in place that'll do that and they will allow it?
Well, I don't think China's going to be. I don't think China would be unique in. First of all, the short answer to the question is I don't know. But I see what you're getting at. This is a very serious question of sovereignty and surveillance and things like that. I don't think China would be unique in wanting to negotiate that very carefully, but not being an expert on satellites, I can still get an enormous amount of data on China right now just simply by going on Google Earth.
We built the camera for Google Earth.
And a hell of a job you did.
I just add, I agree with what Scott said. I'd add that this whole question in international climate change negotiations on verifiable data, I mean, that's already a huge sticking point as we approach Copenhagen. Chinese have been traditionally very sensitive to this idea of someone coming in to verify their data. They will continue to be. There are, on the other hand, I should note, climate change experts, the real experts within China who know what they're doing, who themselves collect data, who very much are pushing their own government to accept this notion of verifiable data because they know that that will help China move forward. So one has to remember China does not think, do, act with one voice. There are huge amounts of debates going on between what I call the technology experts, officials certainly, but they have the technology expertise, and the more political types who are thinking of China's international image, thinking of China's national interests from a completely different perspective. So there are actually people within China who are hoping that the Chinese government will, at some stage, be more receptive to the idea of verifiable data.
Let me add one or two little things. It'd be a little less standoffish on this. I think one interesting case to look back at that had both the pros and the cons of the question that you raise was China's handling of the question of monitoring air quality in the Beijing area in the run-up to the Olympic Games last year. They did permit people from outside China, members of different national Olympic committees. I know that the U.S. Olympic Committee had people who were able to take their own samples of air quality. At the same time, there were questions of what were the things that the Chinese allowed to be measured, exactly the things that you were really interested in, the aspects of air quality. Were games being played with the location of air quality monitors? And I think if I were going to worry about something in particular, I think it would be questions of anything that involved local government officials where they were being evaluated on how well they were complying with various rules in that regard. Whether it's air quality or economic statistics or just about anything else, the Chinese local bureaucracy has a rich and impressive heritage of trying to make sure that the numbers that got to their bosses on which they were going to be evaluated were numbers that showed their locality in a favorable light.
Very nice. Very nicely put, I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. The climate change nowadays is due to years industrial manufacture and the personal lifestyle and behavior. Linda, you have been involved two organizations. One is Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and another one is Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to know what's their basic principle in dealing with the climate change. And also in this FIIA, they have a China program. Do they have other country program? And in this China program, who are in that and what they are talk about? Thank you.
Well, if I start from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, used to have a China program. The whole institute was revamped, and then I became part of the Environment and Resources program, where there were mostly hardcore environmental or resource experts. I was the only so-called country-orientated expert in that program, simply because China's climate change policies at that time, 3 years ago, were of great interest to the European Union. Within CIPRI, CIPRI is traditionally involved with the research of hard security issues. The new China program was just established on March the 1st of this year and will encompass broad foreign policy issues, international issues, of which obviously climate change and climate security is one. We're very much looking at non-traditional security threats, transnational security threats.
All right, lots of questions. Let's go right here with the vest, please.
Dennis Meadows, retired professor. One of the most salient aspects of China's recent work has been the explosive growth in both the capability and the implementation of renewable energy. There are two good reasons for doing that. One is it's a way to reduce carbon emissions, but another motivation can be the perception that global oil production is either has peaked or is soon about to peak and start going down. How do those two figure, do you suppose, in China's current efforts?
China started to emphasize the importance of renewable energy when its reliance on imported oil rose in the mid-1990s. So at that point, certainly people were not talking in China about greenhouse gas emissions. Now then, it's become coupled with this very great advantage of turning to renewable energy is also a great way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But certainly energy security, as you mentioned, the worry about will China be able to secure enough oil to fuel its economic growth. This was the starting point. This is still, I believe, what's very much spurring a lot of the investment that's going into renewable energy. I should note here, though, that in China, nuclear is considered renewable energy. And there's been a massive investment also in the nuclear sector.
I would add that there's a third motivation for doing that, which is that it's part of a broad energy strategy to diversify the sources of China's energy. One motivation for which is so that China does not rely too heavily on any source of energy that can potentially be cut off by someone else.
Yes.
Julian Wong, Center for American Progress. My question is on the idea of military-to-military cooperation in climate security. It's an interesting one. But it strikes me that that level of cooperation, that level of engagement, is more of a response to adaptation needs, climate adaptation, responding to a threat of climate impacts, disaster relief, logistics of moving people, dealing with social unrest. How do we translate that conversation at the adaptation level to an urgency to mitigate emissions? is there a pathway to actually, because it seems like it's rather distinct, that maybe when you're dealing at the adaptation level, you're already in a admission that climate change is imminent, impacts are here, there's little to do with it, there's little that we can do to really mitigate it. How do we translate that to urgent action to actually reduce emissions and actually to have an optimistic outlook that there's something we can do about climate change?
That's a genuinely environmental question. You're going to have to.
To be honest, I mean, obviously these do go hand in hand, but China is making great efforts on the adaptation front and also on the mitigation front, and that's what I would call a pretty robust climate change agenda. Obviously, if you ask the rest of the world, China is not doing enough to mitigate. And as I mentioned in my talk, this tension is going to remain. China is never going to do enough to mitigate, according to the industrialized nations or its neighbors. I see this as a severe tension which will continue.
And vice versa, perhaps.
And, of course, you're quite right, vice versa.
Yes.
My name is Christopher Krause from the National Environmental Education Foundation. Scott, your example about the Chinese Coast Guard / Coast Guards, I found that interesting. And I'm just wondering, did I hear you right, that there are many other examples of sort of agency overlap in terms of responsibilities for, or what we generally consider in the U.S. Responsibility, like what the Coast Guard handles?
You mean specifically with regard to coastal defense?
Well, no, I mean
issues,
just in general. Like, are there other agencies? Is there like, for example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a certain set of responsibilities.
Yes, absolutely. No, one of the most important parts of getting a PhD in Chinese studies at the University of Michigan is having to learn about the nightmare of bureaucracy, overlapping, competing, which is the Chinese system. If you would like to see a little discussion of that with regard to the Chinese environmental sector, I don't know. Do you get in trouble for holding up something from Brookings?
It's manageable trouble. Don't worry.
It is my doctoral advisor. David Sandilow and Kenneth Lieberthal's excellent study on U.S. and China environmental relations has a very fine short section introducing some of the governance and bureaucracy problems that China confronts in dealing with that. But it also approaches some of the same problems with regard to our system, lest we point fingers too quickly.
Right. And in your estimation, is there motivation in Beijing to sort of streamline these sort of processes, or are they more interested in kind of protecting what I'm assuming would be kind of agency turf?
I think that what's happened here, to some extent, is that this is a country that's grown at a tremendous speed, is engaged in an enormous amount of international trade, and has found itself in the last 20, 25 years going from having just a very small number of sort of resource and enforcement and security monitoring responsibilities along its coast to suddenly being the biggest trading country in the world with an enormous naval and fisheries and resources and security set of challenges and missions along its coast, that the sort of thing that the United States has had to deal with for decades and decades. But this is very sudden for China, and what they're dealing with to some extent is the vestiges of a lot of different parts of a small system for a smaller, more divided set of problems from a much earlier time that now has to deal with a vastly bigger set of issues, on top of which is about to land climate change.
Thank you.
I would be very surprised not to see a reorganization of that sometime in the not too distant future. When you talk about bureaucratic reorganization in China, 3 years is a long time. So fairly soon.
In the back, in the blue shirt.
Hi, thank you. My name is Levi Tilleman Dick, and I'm a PhD student at SAIS. Obviously, technology sharing is one of the biggest tools that we have to fight climate change and deal with climate security issues. However, it also has serious implications from the standpoint of international competitiveness. What sort of mechanisms are being developed by the U.S. and China to create effective technology transfer that combats climate change between not only the U.S. but other developed countries and China?
I'm not the right person to answer that. I think we are going to see a few of those mechanisms in place in the new, rather massive initiative that will come out of Obama's clean energy, Sino-U.S. clean energy initiative when he visits Beijing. Obviously, this is a huge worry for both countries. The Chinese are very well aware of it. The U.S. is very well aware of it. The Europeans are well aware of it. I do not have the expertise to talk about these mechanisms.
I could just add a little bit. The JCCT, the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, is going to take place in Beijing within the next month, I believe, in about a month's time. And technological issues of trade have been contentious for a long time. And I know that is on the agenda. And while I'm not sure whether it's directed specifically at environmental technologies, I suspect those will be in the mix. So, again, I don't know the details, but I think it's on the agenda, and both sides, China certainly has emphasized the importance from its perspective of getting some of this technology. And I think our side will want to participate in that, in part because it's a good commercial activity. But the details will have to be worked out. But I think they're on the agenda for sure.
I'd just like to add that the co-development of new technologies is the new phrase. I mean, it's in Lieberthal's and Sanderloh's report as one of the suggestions that they put forward. I know that that's something that the U.S. is trying to get into this big clean energy initiative when they agree on the final wording of it during the Obama visit, whether it'll be used, this co-development. But that's one way, obviously, to deal with some of the problems that you're raising.
Yes, sir. Right here. Yeah.
Mats Anderson, a consultant earlier of the World Bank. Both of you have mentioned the local governments a few times, and I just interested to hear if, Linda, if you have noticed any change in the incentives for the local government officials in terms of, incentive for promotion. There have been a lot of talk about green GDP, resource efficiency, and I'm curious to hear if you have seen any really change in behavior of the local government officials to date, or it's still GDP which is at the forefront?
Well, for some time now, Chinese officials, central-level Chinese officials, have been trying to play with different incentive systems in the evaluation of local officials to get them to pay attention to something other than just rapid economic growth, which for a very long time was regarded as virtually the only thing that local officials were really graded on and had to pay attention to. And you don't just see complaints about this with regard to environment. One of my specialties is policing. You see local police officials complaining like crazy that you can't get local government officials to pay attention to social order problems because they're focusing on growth. That's a striking thing to hear about China. Yes, the efforts to try to change the list of indicators on which these people are, on which local officials are evaluated, have been changing for about the last 15 years, and one of the things that they are trying to evaluate them on more is environmental issues. But this still becomes very hard when you, first of all, when you put a large number of different things in there, when you're supposed to be evaluated, how should I put this? When 20 different things are all a crucial indicator, effectively nothing becomes a crucial indicator. It becomes very, very difficult. And this also gets back to this gentleman's question over here, which is how the government finds adequate ways of monitoring the progress that's undertaken there. And that becomes a real challenge. Monitoring what goes on at local levels becomes a real challenge. The government handicaps itself in one respect in limiting the ability of citizens to organize and to assist in that sort of monitoring, and also limiting the ability of investigative journalists to follow these sorts of things. I'm trying to think of the particular example, but one frequently reads of people who have been jailed for complaining about local environmental problems. The government may then come in and deal with the environmental problem, but that doesn't change the fact that the person who first complained about it got jailed for doing so. So monitoring how well local officials follow the rules that they're supposed to has always been a major challenge for the Chinese government, and remains one, because local officials have an enormous number of incentives and very clever and effective ways of counteracting that monitoring.
I would just add, this very much varies according to locality. I mean, China is such a vast country after all. And also one has to keep in mind that the quote-unquote economic miracle of China was possible because the central government gave up a lot of economic power to the locals, and they are very adamant about keeping that power. So though the central government can issue all sorts of orders about on what basis these evaluations need to be done, de facto, it's still, there's a lot of power in the local governments and the different interest groups who are in collaboration with them.
Just another small incident. I spent a couple of years, 3 years in Shanghai actually, and of course the most famous case of trying to rein in growth was the accusations and then imprisonment of the party secretary in Shanghai. And in a way, that's an indication of what Linda was saying. They're reduced in a way to taking such grand measures because they can't get down below. Now, the purpose of that, of course, was to drive home a point that growth above everything else should be reevaluated. But it also shows, I think, that that's what they're reduced to doing at that level because they can't go down more effectively at the local level. We have time for a couple more questions. Jeff.
Thank you very much. Jeff Tabelko, Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you for both of your presentations. I'll take the liberty of amplifying your response to the Center for American Progress, Mr. Wong's question about adaptation versus mitigation. I think on one level, the dependent variable here in some of those exchanges are security, not climate. And so first and foremost, where in the argument from the security institution's perspective would be they're interested in strengthening the relationship, and particularly in the wake of some misunderstanding, shall we say, around American airplanes or ships close to the Chinese coast, they're looking for areas that are less contentious where they might talk. And so in that sense, for some, it won't be seen as necessary to make a mitigation argument, as well as the obvious ability to cooperate and the rational notion that they have natural disaster preparedness capacities. The United States has them. We can have lessons learned and find a way to talk, a safe way to talk. The U.S. did this an awful lot with the Soviet Union and Russia coming out of the Cold War. It was a way that in uncertain relations you found some common ground. Where it might make that transition to mitigation is in many ways the role that the retired military officers have played in this country, where that community looks at the issue, sees it as something that could eventually end up in their laps, but suggests that it's much cheaper for the civilians to get on with it in terms of addressing mitigation. It's an argument there. So it's a non-traditional voice for mitigation. May or may not be something that could be seen, the PLA playing that role. I wouldn't want to speculate. My question is a very specific one for Linda that plays off your very interesting kind of connection between the Nick report and the change in the approach on this topic. I wonder if you have any similar insights as to what seems to be at least the possibility of a change at the UN. And so in 2007, when the UK chaired a Security Council session on climate security, the Chinese government spoke out very strongly for saying this was an inappropriate forum for this discussion. It was not a security issue. It needed to be dealt with in the social and economic organs of the UN, and the Security Council was not the place for it. So that was April 2007. By the summer, you have a unanimous resolution, again, not nearly, shall we say, as powerful UN organization, but the UN General Assembly passes a climate and security resolution that asks the Secretary General to prepare a report and such. So they at least let this happen. Now, it's obviously much more passive, but do you see any difference in how they are willing or not willing to allow this issue to play in that organ, where obviously they have a big say in what comes to the Security Council and what doesn't?
This is actually something that should be looked into. I haven't. I've concentrated more on the domestic focus. But, I mean, it's certainly an interesting issue to see what China's reactions are going to be.
Are there any more questions? I would entertain one more, I think. Yes, sir. You've got it.
Well, I hope I won't take too long to finish up here. Andrew Holland with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. You briefly brought up food security and wanted to kind of dig down a little bit deeper in this and wondering what the Chinese government is looking at regarding how to maintain domestic food security if arid regions become more arid, and if they're unable to feed the population domestically, would they go to world grain markets? Would they look into doing something like what South Korea in Madagascar has done, UAE, those sorts of things, only on a much larger scale in Africa or somewhere else? Is this something that they stay up nights worrying about?
I definitely think food security is something that troubles the top leaders. I don't know about at night, but during the daytime. And I'm such a foreign policy person that I haven't looked into the details, but in my different researches, I've done quite a lot of work on China and Africa. And a bit to my surprise, they've already started quite an active program at the provincial level. There are 3 or 4 provinces where provincial governors are supporting, encouraging, and even giving incentives in the form of money for agricultural production to take place. It depends on the African country. Are they allowed to buy the land? Are they leasing the land? And so on. But certainly Africa is being thought about as one place where one could meet some of the needs of agriculture. So it's probably happening elsewhere. I've only looked at the African dimension.
I think we should bring this to a close and should express our appreciation to our 2 presenters.